So thanks so much for the invitation to come along to talk today. I want to start with an acknowledgement of country. I'm talking with you from Darug country. I acknowledge the Wadamadigal people of the Darug Nation upon which Macquarie University sits, the traditional land owners of the water and land that nourish me. I also want to acknowledge Wiradjuri country, the place that grew me up. I'm a white settler and I go 7 generations back to Walgett on my nana's side. So I have some ties to regional Australia. So yeah, thanks to the River Basin Management Society for the invitation today. And I want to apologise in advance for inclusion of references to settler colonial violence towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that came up in some research that we did that informs this paper today. This paper was published a couple of years ago and it's on shadow waters, making Australian water cultures visible. This slide shows 2 images that were a focus for that research. The one showing the sandstone escarpment is of the headwaters of the Goulburn River that flows into the Hunter. And the other one of the well-vegetated banks is of the Kajigong River, closer to town in Mudgee. So this paper is a collaborative research output from a research relationship begun some 5 years or so ago around the Mudgee area with Alicia Lonsdale, Emily O'Gorman, Fiona Miller, Laura Hammersley and Wiradjuri peoples from Mudgee. So I've asked their permission to talk to this work today and they're very enthusiastic and excited to have this shared with you. So this idea of shadow waters is a metaphorical one. Obviously connections between people and water have received a lot of attention, especially within geographic research for some time. I'm a geographer, so hence my focus on geography perhaps in some of this work today. One of the most compelling approaches within geography has been the hydrosocial cycle, and that really talks to water's social and political qualities. What we wanted to do with this shadow waters idea is illuminate the cultural dimensions of society water relations through the concept of shadow waters. So shadow waters centres attention on the cultures that privilege certain waters whilst rendering other waters invisible and marginalised in mainstream water management practices and planning process. So shadow waters are metaphorical in the sense that particular water values are hidden or demoted in favour of others, and also literal. For instance, groundwater is usually not as visible as surface water, so it is often shadowed as well. So this idea came from actually walking along the banks of the Kajigong and Goulburn rivers, doing fieldwork in that area and walking and talking with Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people about their experiences and connections to these places. Some of you might know the environmental historian and philosopher Val Plumwood and her work on shadow places. This shadow waters idea comes from that heritage and conversations, like I said, along those rivers. Shadow waters helps to bring to light the way power intersects with cultural practices. So this is a map that we included in the published paper of this talk today. And what the map does is show graphically, well, you know, what geographers love to see, a map for your geography paper, but also graphically how these 2 rivers are related, even though hydrologically they really aren't at all. So the Goulburn flows down to the Hunter, like I said, flowing to the ocean, whereas the Kajigong River joins the Macquarie River and then further downstream into the Darling. So these 2 rivers aren't connected geomorphologically or hydrologically, but they are socially, culturally, economically around the Mudgee area. So the Kajigong has been dammed twice, the Windermere Dam and then Burrendong Dam, which are highlighted on this map. And the Goulburn is, as a headwater of the Hunter, is largely unregulated, aside from the major diversions that were required for the establishment of coal mining in the Upper Goulburn. It was named after a British politician in the 1820s. So to return to this idea of shadow waters, I want to talk a little bit about this shadow places idea to give you a bit of a background for why we want to talk to shadow waters as a concept. So what Plumwood was doing was moving beyond self-sufficient, singular and fragmented notions of place to recognise the implications of our relations with place for other places and how this actively constructs shadow or even sacrificial places. So Plumwood really draws attention to places that are often hidden, overlooked, degraded and exploited for their resources, places that elude knowledge and responsibility. Similarly, with the shadow waters idea, we want to talk to those places, those watery places that are marginalised, demoted, degraded, but then are also perhaps protected by shadows. And that was our contribution to this shadow place language as well. Shadows aren't always about the negative. Shadows can also be about protecting and nurturing things that are out of view. So that sort of tension was key to our paper on shadow waters. So this image is of the Kajigong River in 1906. As you can see, it's well before any damming had happened, and perhaps also well before a lot of intensive agriculture, certainly before wine and honey became known as some of the major outputs for this part of Western New South Wales. So research by historians in the last few decades have shown the extent of violence associated with British colonisation, and we can see that there was really very serious dispossession of Wiradjuri of their lands and waters over that time of settling by the invaders. The settling states' modes of water and land management became dominant, and Wiradjuri knowledge was seemingly marginalised in these processes. These modes of management have shifted over time and also become more entrenched. Particular approaches have been inscribed in the landscape, creating physical as well as cultural legacies that shape lives and livelihoods today. These include really enduring as well as changing European farming practices, mining of a variety of elements and minerals from gold to most recently coal, and substantial water infrastructure. So one of the interviews that we did in this research was with Sam, a Wiradjuri person, and this image shows the coal mine, Yulin coal mine in the background, and overlaid is her story of these violent histories and presences. Because of Mudgee's contact history, Sam said, like there were massacres and they moved people out, and people who were here married in with non-Aboriginal people. There's never been a big community like in Dubbo or Bathurst or Orange, and we're sort of in a time warp behind everyone else. So we've got our land council like 20 years behind everyone else. So it's not like there's been a big established community that they've had to deal with. So it probably wasn't until the early 1990s that they actually started talking to a community, consulting with community, and that was with Yulin, the image in the background, a coal mine, but prior to that, they just did whatever. So this really highlights how only recently Indigenous people are recognised in the Mudgee area as being custodians, and therefore also necessary to consult when any form of resource management happens. Anything beyond consultation is still, it's hoped for, but it doesn't seem to be happening a lot in the Mudgee area. There have been many conflicts and disagreements over how some resource management issues have progressed. So one of these resource management pressures in this area has included the intensification of land use for estates like the Riverside Estate, which is on a floodplain of Mudgee. This estate was, I think, also the subject of part of the IPAC inquiries a few years ago. What was interesting when talking to some of the people involved in the land and water management practices of this heavily settled part of New South Wales was that there was such a strong and enduring focus on development. And indeed, when we interviewed a senior administrator on the Midwestern Regional Council, he said that the area is governed with an ethos of development at any cost. So we can see here some of the tensions between settler colonial practices and ideas of transformation. So returning to Sam and her experience of the rivers in this part of the world. So what Sam said was that, like out that way, and she's talking about the Goulburn River here, she's saying that out that way it's all about, like it's on the edge of trade routes, ceremonial trade route, that sort of area, where here is more habitation. She's talking about the Kajigong River, which is the image in the back of this slide. So this is where people live. That's why there are so many campsites around town where they would have put houses and stuff like that. And for the downstream, like Bulma, downstream the Kajigong, is where you get really good stone resources. So it's kind of different areas, but even in terms of the river here, like you used to be able to eat the bottom of the reeds out of the river when you're in a canoe. You used to be able to get to, sorry, that's a typo, that should be mussels, M-U-S-S-E-L-S, up there, but I wouldn't eat nothing out of there now. Oh, no way. It's just more sediment build up and more of them reeds, and it's just a lot different. So we can see here that Wiradjuri people view the Kajigong as a trashed river system, one that needs rehabilitation. In contrast, settler colonial practices are elevating the cultural values of the Kajigong by including walkways along it, introducing quite a garden sort of estate around it, and transforming the river as a site of leisure. So in a way, we could see that the Goulburn River, with its history of having headwaters blown up for a mine and its continuing use of water for mining practices, but the Goulburn River and the drip in particular, which is one of the most spectacular features on the Goulburn, that these are a form of a shadowy water place or a watery shadow place. And that includes both surface water and groundwater. A watery shadow place that people, quoting Plumwood here, don't know about, don't want to know about, and in a commodity regime don't ever need to know about or take responsibility for. While the Kajigong River in the town is highlighted as a desirable resource that people want to maintain, although there is no talk of any dam removal, which would be a really interesting development for that part of the world. I suppose with the dam removal that have greater risk of the walk along the river being damaged through floods, although that might also be welcome. So this is a quote from a local landowner and wine producer, someone who is from a family that was one of the first settlers in colonisation of the Mudgee area. And he said, the biggest battle we've got, the question you haven't asked, which no one asks, is how do you restrict the water allocation to the farmers who think it's a God-given right? And no one can answer that to our knowledge. But we sorted out the river really easily by this buyback. What we haven't done is groundwater. It's too tricky, and a wonderful way to study groundwater would be to do coal seam gas at the same time. It's the next big answer. So we can see here that extracting more fossil fuels from the Mudgee area is seen as a desirable thing and something that would also increase scientific knowledge of this catchment, perhaps perversely. Returning to this idea of shadow waters and trying to bring some of these stories together, Val Plumwood asks for a politics of place that is both social and ecological. She invites us to value not only those places we identify as special and aesthetically beautiful, like the drip on this image, but also shadow places that we don't have to know about, but whose degradation we as commodity consumers are indirectly responsible for. So shadow waters really takes that idea of shadow places and applies it to the geographies of water to explain how some water bodies are privileged while others are marginalised in resource decision making. So with the Goulburn and how Indigenous women, in particular Wiradjuri women around the Mudgee area have been using and celebrating this place despite its shadowing, in a conversation that took place actually along the Kajigong, we spoke with Tara and Sam, and these are pseudonyms that have been used to protect the identities of people in this area. Tara said a lot of the women's sites, groundwater is sacred to them as well, and even some of the women's business is to do with groundwater as well and caretaking of that. And I said, well, how does that work? They reckon they don't affect it, mines don't affect it. What are you talking about? So it's really hard getting them to understand that it might be under the ground and it might be just water to you, but it affects people and community. When the rivers get sick, we get sick people, and this affects their ability to pass on knowledge and enjoy those places. So in these conversations around shadow waters, the question was raised of whether we can do things differently. And this idea of decolonisation might be helpful here. Decolonisation, according to Maori intellectual Linda Tuiwa-Smith, is once viewed as the formal process of handing over the instruments of government, now recognised as a long-term process involving the bureaucratic, cultural, linguistic and psychological divesting of colonial power. Perhaps this shadow waters idea might be another tool or strategy for helping to divest colonial power somewhat. What we have tried to do in working with our collaborators as a collaboration is to think about shadow waters that work in vertical, horizontal planes, also temporal planes. Settler colonialism continues in the greater Mudgee area. It's still a very white place. Applying a critical lens to resource management shifts in the two rivers in recent history, we can see a mixture of strategic engagement by Wiradjuri people and ongoing frontier expansion. Some of that strategic engagement came about with the creation of the national park before the New South Wales election in 2015. But at the same time, we have this ongoing frontier expansion with further threats of coal seam gas and certainly expansion of more coal mining in the area. The shadow waters concept might help reveal invisible processes that underpin quite complex social water relations. So to finish, that's just an image of the lyrebird near the drip that you can see under a bit of sandstone escarpment there. That's it. Thank you.